Let's go ahead, and I guess I need my sermon notes, don't I? I've always wondered how that would be to preach without notes, but not today. Not today. Especially not for this one. All right, well, I'm going to continue doing what I've been doing for some time, of course. I'm going to keep teaching through Matthew's Gospel. And as you know, I've broken this down into different sections, and we are in section 6 as I've outlined Matthew. This is basically from about the end of chapter 20 all the way through to the very end of chapter 25. So that is section 6. And this, of course, describes the events of Jesus' final visit to Jerusalem before his crucifixion. So this is very much drawing toward the end of Matthew's Gospel. And I've titled this whole section, Jesus Pronounces Judgment Against Israel and Its Leaders. Because when he gets to Jerusalem, this is basically his last chance to kind of say everything all at once that he has observed and seen, and all the ways that they need to be confronted, especially for their lack of acceptance toward him as their Messiah. So it is, in a sense, a very judgmental section of Scripture, but very much needed to be as well. And as of now, as we've been teaching through this, we've come to another division of this. So again, I go from my sections of Matthew to the portions within those sections. We're in about the fifth and final portion of this section that I've been in. And this, of course, is what we call the Olivet Discourse. This is roughly Matthew 24 and 25. This is a private sermon from Jesus to his disciples on the Mount of Olives, just outside of Jerusalem. So he's kind of drawn away from the rest of the nation, just talking to his disciples at this point. And in this sermon, Jesus predicts and describes the destruction of Jerusalem's temple, his second coming, and also the end of the age. So a very long and very weighty section here, a portion, I should say. So anyway, we've made it far enough into all of that that we've been discussing the Great Tribulation of Judea, as Jesus calls it, and we've been discussing that for the past 3 sermons. So we kind of made it some ways, and then we just got stuck in this one passage because there's so much here to talk about. Let's go ahead and read this passage for today. So this is Matthew 24, verses 15 through 21. And I'll go ahead and read those now to remind you of where we are. So he says, "Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. Whoever is on the housetop must not go down to get the things that are in his house. Whoever is in the field must not turn back to get his cloak. But woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days. But pray that your flight will not be in the winter or on a Sabbath. For then there will be a great tribulation, such as has not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will." So after 3 messages, I am finally ready to discuss the whole purpose of Christ in this passage, which is amazing to think after spending all the time I have spent on this passage. We've not yet gotten to why Jesus has even brought this up. And as of today, we can finally get to that. And the whole purpose is to tell people to flee, to run away, get out of there when you see these things start happening. Even though this passage is full of God's judgment, the whole purpose of Christ is to make sure that his followers have a chance to be safe at this time. It really is trying to help them be well at this very difficult time that he's describing. Presumably, Jesus tells people to flee to the mountains or to the hill country, depending on how your Bible translation handles it. He tells them to flee there because it's harder for armies to get there. And if you get up into the hills or the mountains, you're a little safer. Not necessarily the most comfortable place to be, but a lot safer than anywhere else it would be. And he tells people to get there when they see these things start to happen. According to Jesus, the moment that abomination of desolation is revealed, everyone should leave behind everything and get to safety. That should be their top priority. And yet, even something as basic as a command to flee raises some new questions. Of course, as everything does in the Olivet Discourse, raises plenty of new questions. And so a whole sermon is needed just to talk about this. And so this whole sermon today is very much centered around that command to flee and trying to make as much sense of it as we can as we think about it here as we read the passage. So I've titled this sermon, Head for the Hills, based on the very command given by Jesus. So that's what's going on today. That's the title of the sermon today. And my outline for this sermon has 5 headings. So I'll give these to you up front so you know where we're going with everything. First thing I want to do is I want to begin with a pretty thorough review of my recent sermons on this passage. It's kind of been a while, so I want to make sure we're all fresh and up to date here. So I want to talk about all the stuff I've been saying about what I think the Great Tribulation of Judea is. I very much have the view, as others do, that it's talking about a time back then in the 1st century when the Jews revolted against Rome and brought the wrath of Rome down upon them. So I want to talk about that and go through all that again with you just briefly. Secondly, I want to explain that people would either have judgment or salvation depending on how hard they tried to understand Jesus. So the command to flee and everything surrounding it is a little more difficult than just obeying it. There's something going on there that we need to talk about for sure, and it very much depends. People's lives depend on this, so it's very much important for them. I want to talk about that in my second heading. Thirdly, Jesus teaches that this great tribulation is going to be so horrible that even fleeing from it might be a tribulation of its own. You get the impression that even those that do run away don't necessarily have it easy. And there's some dangers there I want to talk about. Fourthly, we have reason to believe that some Christians did indeed leave Judea before the great Jewish revolt against Rome began. And I know some of you have been asking about that, and I want to talk about that and go back into some history and see what happened at that time. But then in my last heading, 5th and final heading, I want to raise the possibility that Jesus might be describing a yet later chance than what those people were doing. So there's some history there I want to talk about, but I do kind of wonder if Jesus has something else in mind, and I want to talk about that at the very end. So yes, there's quite a lot to do today on just the command to flee. Head for the hills is not even as easy as it sounds looking back on it from where we are. So that's what we're talking about today. Now, in a sense, this command to flee the great tribulation of Judea is, I think, a picture of God's salvation of whatever kind we might talk about. Whatever you think of when you think of God's salvation, spiritual or something physical, there's very much a pattern that God has as he deals with people, and that pattern is evident in this passage as well. On the one hand, people in Judea who followed Christ, believed his teachings, and dedicated themselves to watchfulness would be spared the judgment falling on that country. That's the whole point of this warning that he gives. But on the other hand, even their escape from that judgment came at a price, leaving behind their entire old life and enduring hardship along the way. And if what I just said sounds kind of familiar to you, it's because I'm describing how God deals with his people. I mean, that's this age of the world. That's what it means for God to save people. That is the life of the faithful. You want to follow God? Great. It'll turn out well in the end. There's going to be a lot of hardship along the way. And this one event here is just a small picture of all of that. So if you want to kind of apply this as a kind of so what kind of thing, well, just think about your salvation and how that is and how that works as we talk about all this stuff these people were going to face at this time. So there's your background thought you can have as I go through all of this. We're going to begin with that review I promised, trying to talk about the stuff that I've already said in previous sermons. I want to give a review of my 3 recent sermons on this same passage, just make sure we're all caught up to date on everything I've said. Now, when I began to address this passage, I gave you, first of all, an overview of the great Jewish revolt against Rome that happened roughly from the year 66 to the year 73. I did that because I believe that's what Jesus is describing here, and I'm not alone in that opinion. But I wanted to kind of fill you in on that because it's not commonly covered in history books, at least as you get history in school. So I wanted to make sure we all had the kind of base level knowledge that we needed. So I gave you an overview of the great Jewish revolt in 7 stages. So first, I introduced you to our primary source for the great Jewish revolt, Josephus, a historian, a Jew, who was very much part of these things and writing them down. And we have a lot of stuff from him, and it's very helpful. I argued that he was so valuable as an eyewitness because he was a participant in both sides of the conflict. He started off as a Jewish freedom fighter and became a Roman lackey, which gives him at least a very unique perspective and a very helpful one from a historical perspective. Secondly, I described how the Great Jewish Revolt began due to some inflammatory actions of the governor that the Jews had at that time. So the Roman governor Florus, in about the year 66, started creating all kinds of trouble, and things were already bad between the Jews and Rome at that time, but this was the last straw, and they just said, we've had it, we are revolting. And then thirdly, I recounted a failed attempt by the Romans to take Jerusalem immediately. At the very beginning of the war, they went all out, cut off the head of this rebellion, and that didn't work out so well for them. A Roman army under the command of Cestius Gallus tried to take Jerusalem and was gloriously defeated. It was a huge victory for the rebels at that point, massive embarrassment for the Romans, which leads into the fourth stage of things that I talked about. I basically commented that the Jews were doing so well there at the beginning, they decided they had time to start fighting each other. So we talked about how this rebellion just breaks into factions, and now all the Jews are killing each other, basically. And I talked about the 5 different factions that were at work there at that time, and I called them by names that I hope to be as descriptive as possible, somewhat based on historical words, but some of these are just my own. I referred to them as the moderates, the original zealots, the royal zealots, the outsiders, and then the Idumeans, who were kind of this other people group that were sticking their business into this war and getting involved in various ways. Now all of that, we get through all of that, we come to the 5th stage of things, and that is the successful Roman siege of Jerusalem. They came back with another army under General Titus, effectively surround the city, and begin to choke it to death, which is exactly what happened to Jerusalem in the year 70. And then the next thing I did, my 6th kind of phase of things, we just talked about the aftermath of that and how horrible all that was. So basically, the city of Jerusalem was entirely leveled. The temple was torn down, just as Jesus says at the beginning of the Olivet Discourse. And the landscape around Jerusalem became just a wasteland, unrecognizable to anyone who had been there before. As for the Jews themselves, there were about 1 million of them dead by this time, and the other 1.6 million became slaves or captives of some other kind, used for other very foul purposes. So not a good ending for the Jewish revolt, and that isn't even really the ending because there's one more phase. We talked about how it all came to an end. The final action of the Great Jewish Revolt at Masada, this final fortress that the rebels had, and how the Romans finally overcame it in a very historic defeat in its own way, but certainly not a good one for the Jews. And with all that history that I gave you at that time, we have a better chance of looking at this passage and making sense of the things mentioned by Jesus, seeing the correlations, and making the argument that this is what he's talking about. And we start in the details with the abomination of desolation, which brings me to the next sermon that I did on this, talking about the abomination of desolation and what Jesus means by that. And I made 6 points about this at the time, really dug in, and went all the way back to Daniel for this kind of thing. First, I argued that the wording here, abomination of desolation, used in the Gospels but also in the book of Daniel, connects very well to the Great Jewish Revolt because the whole phase of history was one great abomination and one great desolation. Everything that makes you sick and repulsed, everything that could destroy a nation, it happened then and there. So a very good wording to use for talking about this time in history. Secondly, I just made some comments, some introductory comments about Daniel, because Jesus refers to the book of Daniel. That's his source for this abomination of desolation. So I said that Daniel primarily tries to talk about the sovereignty of God and the coming kingdom of God, but he does that through talking about historical events, mainly great national events with big empires and kingdoms, and how God is over all of that and guiding all of that into his kingdom, which would come eventually. And then, kind of zooming in a bit on Daniel, we talked about a king mentioned by Daniel, not by name, but who is certainly there. If you read the descriptions Daniel gives, and if you're familiar with the history of the Jewish people in particular. We talked about this guy named Antiochus IV, also known as Epiphanes. This is the guy, kind of the center of everything surrounding what the Jews celebrate in Hanukkah. So this is a time of a great persecutor coming against the Jews having their own rebellion at that time, successfully overthrowing all of that about 200 years before this great Jewish revolt against the Romans that failed so miserably. The Jews actually have had a history of success throwing off oppressive rulers. It just didn't work out for them well later. But back in that time, the time of Antiochus, they actually managed to do that. Daniel says some things about that as he gives his catalog of history. Now, zooming in a little further on that, we talked about some passages where Daniel mentions the abomination of desolation. And this is a phrase that Daniel uses for things that Antiochus IV was doing to the Jews back then, especially to the temple. One of the famous events in Jewish history, as they will tell you around Hanukkah season, basically Antiochus rolled into Jerusalem, he took over the temple, ended the daily sacrifices to God, set up an idol in the temple, sacrifices a pig, an unclean animal, to that idol, just defiles everything, which gets the Jews in a great uproar, of course, causing them to rebel. But all of that was known to the Jews as the abomination of desolation. So that is kind of the first thing that probably a lot of Jesus' disciples would have thought of as he's talking about all this. And that raises the question, of course, okay, well then what does the abomination of desolation have to do with anything later? Why is Jesus talking about this as a future event? Well, I made the argument that even in the book of Daniel, you can see that he might even imply a sort of echo of that, a sort of second abomination of desolation that would come later on in the Roman era of history. And we talked about the possibilities there and how Daniel might be talking about that, which of course dovetails into Christ and what he says. He's talking about the abomination of desolation as something future. In the very least, he means to draw a comparison to what happened earlier in Jewish history in the time of Antiochus, but saying that that kind of thing is going to happen again. And that may very well be what the book of Daniel is trying to say on that point. So all of that just to say that Jesus is very reasonable in his use of the phrase abomination of desolation, and so it makes sense for him to talk that way, but we still didn't know exactly what he might mean by that as a matter of history, which brought us to the third sermon that we had on this, and which I will review for you right now. I dedicated a whole sermon, my most recent sermon, just trying to figure out if we can identify a precise fulfillment for this abomination of desolation. Looking at the events of the Great Jewish Revolt, is there anything that would have stood out as the abomination of desolation, which people could see and use to take warning from that? Well, I went through that, and I had, again, kind of phases to that sermon. First of all, I admitted that the wording of Christ is somewhat troublesome because it is so indirect, but ultimately it encourages alertness among his disciples. Yeah, it's kind of vague, but what that does is it means you're always watching. If you're a Jew, a Jewish Christian living there in that time, you're not going to allow yourself to kind of laze off and just not pay attention to things. You're going to be paying very careful attention to events around you, which is actually helpful. I mean, if your goal as a preacher is to get people's attention and keep their attention so that they remember things, this will do it. I mean, it might be kind of vague, but it makes sure your mind is always working and always watching. Now, I did go on to say, though, that Jesus does give us three criteria for figuring out what he means by the abomination of desolation. And I went over to Luke for one of them, that Jerusalem would be surrounded by armies. The other two are here in Matthew, and that's the defiling of the temple, which of course is very much implied by the abomination of desolation. And then finally, that there is enough forewarning from this that does allow escape, which of course is the whole point of Christ. When you see this, get out of there. It implies that there is time to get out of there if you will move quickly. So those are our criteria for figuring out what this is. Now, in my last sermon, I did come down to say that there are maybe 4 options that come out of this, and different Christians, as they study this and they come to their opinions, they might target one of these. I gave you all 4 of them. I had my preferences, but I did want to talk about all 4 of them. So the first option was Governor Florus and one of his inflammatory actions at the very beginning, which was robbing the temple and also following that with a raid on Jerusalem. Sounds kind of like what the abomination of desolation might be. Second option that some Christians have pointed out was when the Jews themselves decide to stop offering sacrifices on behalf of Caesar and other foreigners, which of course was an act of war in the eyes of the Romans, because now the Jews are not interceding for us with their God, so they must be against us now. So some Christians talk about that as possibly the abomination of desolation. The third option was one of the rebel leaders there in Jerusalem. His name was Eleazar bar Simon. He led the original Zealot faction. They actually took over the temple and used it as their headquarters and did all kinds of crazy stuff in the temple that would have been defiling. So again, might be the warning shot that Jesus has in mind, the abomination of desolation. And then finally, although this one might be a little bit too late to do anything about running away, but the fourth option is just General Titus himself, his own defilement and destruction of the temple there at the end of the Jewish siege. Various Christians will target any of those as the abomination of desolation. I tend to favor, one or three if you're wanting my preferences, but as I said, the whole period is an abomination of desolation in itself. So it's kind of hard to pick one thing that is the abomination of desolation. Point is that there are all kinds of warning signs that if you're sitting there watching these things, you have plenty of reason to get out of there, according to the words of Jesus. And that leads us, of course, into my theme for today, talking about that command to flee. So let's move out of our review. Let's get into some new stuff. So let's talk about the very exhortation that Jesus gives here. And I want to begin with this little detail that he throws in, or that somebody throws in, this phrase, let the reader understand. Because it's very much there and I do want to talk about it. I've talked about it a little, but I want to say a bit more. From this exhortation, what we really see is that people would either have judgment or salvation depending on how hard they try to understand Jesus at this point. So this phrase, let the reader understand, it actually does serve a purpose in this passage. It might be in parentheses, but it's there for a reason. Now we have to admit, we are not entirely sure whether this is an exhortation spoken by Jesus or an exhortation from Matthew as he writes his gospel. It's kind of hard to tell. Maybe you've never thought about that, but it could go either way. On the one hand, Christ himself may have said these words to his disciples as he taught them on the Mount of Olives. This might be something that Jesus himself said at that time. If that's the case, then what Jesus means is that he's exhorting readers of Daniel to be careful how they understand it. So let the readers of Daniel understand. Because again, he just referred to the book of Daniel. That makes sense. It makes sense for him to say that at this time. However, we must also admit the possibility that this exhortation comes not from Jesus, but from Matthew as he's writing his gospel. We must also include Mark in that because he also includes this. If you go over to the Olivet Discourse in Mark's gospel, he also includes let the reader understand. But in this case, if Matthew and Mark are the ones telling us to understand what we read, they might not be referring to Daniel's book, they might be referring to the Olivet Discourse as you're reading it right now. Honestly, we don't have enough evidence to really argue for one side or the other definitively. I feel like if we spent any more time on it, it would be kind of a waste of our time because there's nothing definitive that can be said on this. What we do know is that as we consider this abomination of desolation, whether from Daniel's book or from the words of Jesus, or both, we must put some effort into understanding it. There's a reason that somebody said, let the reader understand. That they saw fit to include this exhortation to be careful how you understand this stuff. And since I have spent 3 messages altogether trying to identify the abomination of desolation, trying to give you context to make sense of all this, I think you can see some of the difficulties involved, especially for us, looking back all that time ago. It certainly is hard and does require some effort at understanding. Now, for us, these difficulties are simply the typical troubles of study, right? We're studying the Bible. The Bible can be a very difficult book. Men twist it to their own destruction, as Peter says in another place. But it's just kind of the thing we're used to. I mean, we're used to coming in here and saying, oh, here are the possibilities, which one is most likely to be true. We're used to that. But for anyone living in Judea before and during the Great Tribulation there that Jesus describes, the stakes were far higher for identifying the abomination of desolation and understanding these things well enough to get the warning that Jesus has in mind. I mean, for them, it really is a matter of life or death. And as these teachings from Jesus circulated among Jewish believers there in Judea in the decades before the revolt, the only proper response was to memorize these teachings, meditate on them, and watch for their fulfillment. I mean, if you hear this kind of thing, you're going to say, okay, this is important. We can't forget this. We got to make sure we're always thinking and always looking out for the kinds of stuff that Jesus is describing here. They're going to put effort into that for the sake of their own lives. Which all raises the question, which I've kind of talked about already, but I want to talk about it a little more. It raises the question, why was Jesus not more plain about the abomination of desolation? Why not speak more clearly about what he means? If lives are on the line, why not be more direct? Does Jesus not care about the lives of his followers or other people? I mean, why would he not be as direct as he could be? Well, I can suggest two answers to that. And the first one is one that I've given you before, as I said in my last sermon. That whole 3-year period from the time the war really got going up until the destruction of Jerusalem, that whole period of time was one long abomination of desolation. Everything about it was so defiling and so destructive that it's kind of hard to even narrow down the phrase what you mean by abomination of desolation. If the wording of Christ is indirect, it is also broad enough to serve as a 3-year warning. You've got, in a sense, all kinds of occasions to take warning from the events you see. I gave you 4 options earlier for what the abomination of desolation is. At all 4 junctures, you've got a chance to take warning and get out of there if you still can. So it might be indirect wording, but it's broad enough to where it serves as an ongoing warning for people. Perhaps this would even increase the number of people who would get the hint. Keeps them always watching. Even if they decide, well, this might not be what Jesus had in mind, I'm just going to stay put. Maybe the second or the third time you're thinking, okay, now I'm seeing way too much click together, I'm getting out of here, I am leaving. This might actually be helpful to be a little more indirect because it's broad enough to encompass everything happening at that time so that more people get the warning as they just see things unravel. But there's another possibility I want to talk about for why Jesus is so indirect. And this comes from the parables of Jesus. And Chad almost stole my thunder earlier talking about this passage because he read it to you. I want to read from the parable of the sower in which Jesus says something I think is very relevant for this. This is Matthew 13, verse 9, if you do want to turn back there. I just want to read it and make a few comments. Again, this is from the parable of the sower. He says at one point in here, Matthew 13, verse 9, says, "He who has ears, let him hear." And the disciples came and said to him, "Why do you speak to them in parables?" Jesus answered them, "To you it has been granted to know the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it has not been granted. For whoever has, to him more shall be given, and he will have an abundance. But whoever does not have, even what he has shall be taken away from him. Therefore I speak to them in parables, because while seeing they do not see, and while hearing they do not hear, nor do they understand." Now don't miss the similar exhortation there that you might notice there. He who has ears, let him hear. Kind of similar to let the reader understand. Kind of his exhortation to make sure you're doing the right thing with what you're hearing and what you're reading. Both very much the same kind of thing. With regard to the abomination of desolation, we might say, he who has understanding, let him understand. There's very much an exhortation at work here whenever Jesus is teaching to be careful with what you're hearing. We see from his parables that Jesus sometimes taught in ways which would not be comprehended by the faithless, but in ways which would make sense to anyone who tried, who very much cared about following him. If you're going to hear these stories that Jesus tells and say, that doesn't mean anything, I don't get that, I'm going back to what I was doing, you're not going to learn anything from them, and you're not going to understand the gospel. You're not going to get any benefit from the teachings of Jesus. But if you care, you're going to sit there, you're going to think about these parables, you're going to make sense of them. one way or another. You're going to do that. And you're going to benefit from those parables. That's how the teachings of Jesus sometimes work. Now, for the first group, their carelessness and their resultant ignorance was an act of judgment on them. Because they didn't care to hear these things and to think about them and understand them, they kept doing what they were doing, and they lost what little they had. On the other side of things, those who believed and cared, for them it was salvation. Because they bothered to hear and bothered to try to follow Jesus in these ways, they would get salvation. They would understand the gospel, they would believe, and they would be saved. So it was, I think, with the abomination of desolation in just kind of a different way. Either judgment or salvation. It depended on how hard they tried to understand. Are you going to hear this stuff about the abomination of desolation and just dismiss it as some vague nonsense? Or are you going to sit there, are you going to wait, are you going to watch, and you're trying to figure out if things happening around you are fitting what Jesus was talking about? If you do, you'll get the warning and you'll get out of there in time to save your life. That is, I think, the other explanation for why Jesus does this the way he does this. The indirect nature of it. This is just how he deals with people depending on whether they're faithless or faithful. He teaches in that way so that one side gets judgment, the other side gets salvation because they actually try to do something with his teachings. Just like the parables. All right, well with that, we come to something a little more concrete, something a little more tangible we can talk about here. My third heading. In this passage, Jesus teaches that the Great Tribulation is going to be so horrible that even those fleeing from it might be caught in a tribulation of their own. Just getting out of there might be so difficult that that's going to be hard on them. So let's read the passage again just to get these details in mind. Listen now to what he says about people who are fleeing. They're following the warning that he's giving them. So what do they endure? Well, let's start again in verse 15. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand, then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. Whoever is on the housetop must not go down to get the things that are in his house. Whoever is in the field must not turn back to get his cloak. But woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days. But pray that your flight will not be in the winter or on a Sabbath. For then there will be a great tribulation, such as has not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will. Now, most of what Jesus says there is easy to understand in terms of the difficulties being faced by people who are trying to get out of there. I mean, he talks about people that they can't get anything out of their house. To get away, they got to go up into the mountains, so not exactly the easiest place to go for a hike, when you're trying to get out of there. He talks about people leaving behind their cloaks, so if it's cold, you're going to be cold. I mean, if you've got babies, you're going to have trouble. If it's wintertime, you're going to have rough weather. I mean, you got all this stuff that could possibly happen. I mean, all of that is basically pretty easy to understand. And I just want to let it stand for you there in your mind as the difficulties of getting away. Out of the frying pan into the fire is kind of how this is. There's the promise of getting out of there, but it's going to be really, really hard. I do want to talk about one detail in particular because it's the one thing that may not connect with you so well as it would have with the people who first heard this and Matthew's readers as well. And that is, I want to talk about why the Sabbath day presents such a difficulty for trying to flee from the Great Tribulation. All right, so I want to comment on that in particular. So the chief idea of the Sabbath day is that you're supposed to rest on that day. No work on the Sabbath. It's one of the 10 commandments that the Jews were given by God. Very much a big part of their law. Now, based on how some Jews applied that command, fleeing on the Sabbath might have been especially difficult. That could be like the worst day of the week for you to make a run for your life, the Sabbath day. This is one of those details in Matthew's gospel which might indicate, by the way, that he is very much writing for a Jewish audience in Israel. I know I've made that argument throughout the Matthew study, but I think this is one of the details that also brings that out, because neither Mark nor Luke mention the Sabbath when they record this teaching. For them, it doesn't matter. They're writing to more Gentile audiences. Matthew, if he's writing to a Jewish audience, they're in Israel, the Sabbath day matters. Everyone who is there has been brought up to obey the Sabbath. So it's going to matter to them. So I just throw that in there as another mark of why I think Matthew's gospel was written primarily to Jewish believers in Israel. But let's talk about these problems. One of the problems for Jews fleeing on the Sabbath is the idea of a Sabbath day's journey. Maybe you've heard this phrase. It does show up, I think, from time to time in the New Testament, a Sabbath day's journey. So the whole root idea of this, going back to the law of Moses, Moses said that you should not leave home on the Sabbath. If you want to see that, it's back in Exodus chapter 16, verse 29. We don't need to go there now, but that's where it is. So one of the things you do, how do you rest on the Sabbath? Well, one thing you do, don't leave home. Now, of course, there's always a history of interpretation with these things, and the Jews had all kinds of traditions about this. The normal interpretation of that commandment was that no one should travel more than 2,000 cubits from their home on the Sabbath. There was a length limit from how far you could go from the door of your house. Now, if you're wondering how far that is, 2,000 cubits is nearly 3/5 of a mile. Okay, so put it in measurements that most of us can understand here. 3/5 of a mile is about 2,000 cubits. You cannot go further than that from your home on the Sabbath. Now, some Jews were more strict than that. They said that a Sabbath day's journey was only 1,000 cubits. So they cut the normal one in half, and they said, so basically about a quarter of a mile. So about a quarter of a mile, you can go that far away from your home, but you can't go any further than that. In either case, that's no good if you're running for your life. If you're trying to get as far away from danger as possible, and the danger is where you live, and you can't travel far from where you live, you're not going to make it very far. You're not going to get out of there so easily. So there's one big problem with fleeing on the Sabbath. Now, to make matters worse, if the enemy catches you on the Sabbath, you might not be able to defend yourself on the Sabbath. You might not be able to pick up a weapon and protect yourself from anyone trying to kill you on the Sabbath. Now, we got some history behind this. This again goes back to the days of Antiochus IV Epiphanes and that Jewish revolt that was actually successful back in that time, all around the Hanukkah season that we often talk about. So back in that time, there were some Jews, not all Jews, but there were some Jews who decided that they would not fight on the Sabbath. And those Jews died on the Sabbath, those who decided that. There were some Jews that were just so pious, they did not want to fight on the Sabbath. So all the king's men had to do was wait for a Sabbath day and go kill these people because they're not going to defend themselves on that day. That happened. And then about a century later, after Israel had come under the dominion of Rome, so Rome always has this habit of taking native peoples and sort of making them a part of their army. They're called auxiliary units for those of you that are history buffs. The Jews were exempted from that. The Jews were actually exempted from any service with the Roman army on the basis of the fact that they could not march on the Sabbath, they could not fight on the Sabbath, they can't do anything on the Sabbath. So the Romans, in kind of a rare act of mercy, kind of exempted them from the army. There were some Jews who joined anyway, but they were the more irreligious Jews. The really pious Jews were exempted from the army, and for very much the reason of the Sabbath, because they could not fight or travel or march or anything like that on the Sabbath. So all that to say, fleeing for your life or even fighting for your life may not have been possible if it fell on the Sabbath. If you're trying to keep that law, the Sabbath is going to make it really hard for you to get away. Now you might be thinking to yourselves, yes, Stan, but Christians are not required to rest on the Sabbath. We don't really carry that over from the law of Moses. That's not really what we do. And to that I say, yes, you are absolutely correct. But these are not just Christians we're talking about. We're talking about Jewish Christians. These are people that were born and raised with just a few things that were constantly said to them. And one of them was rest on the Sabbath, rest on the Sabbath, no work on the Sabbath. It's like one of the big rules they're trying to follow. And you should know from reading the New Testament that Jewish Christians took a long time to figure out just how much freedom they had from the law of Moses. There was a lot of controversy in the New Testament specifically over those kinds of points between Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians. It was a huge problem. Believe me, at this time, there were probably Jewish Christians there in Judea who really wanted to get away, but found it really hard to get away because of the Sabbath day, because they're still in that mindset. And that's why the Sabbath poses such a problem for fleeing away from these terrible things that are about to befall the Jewish people there in Jerusalem. And that is a sign also, I would say, zooming out for a bit beyond Christians to the rest of the nation, that's a sign of the severity of the judgment on that nation that fell. You got a whole nation of people that might really want to run away but can't, depending on what day of the week it is. So all that to say, between the threat of winter weather and caring for newborn babies and the Sabbath and all these things that Jesus mentions in this passage, even fleeing from the Great Tribulation might be a tribulation in itself. It's going to be really hard to get away. And you're going to have to do a lot of praying as you're running to get out of there, because only God's going to get you out of there. And that is basically the tone of this warning to flee. Like, you should get out of there, but it's going to be really, really hard to do for all these things. All right, now all this talk of escaping the Great Tribulation raises the question whether anyone acted on the warning given by Jesus. Did anyone get out of there? Did anybody flee before this great Jewish revolt happened? Well, in answering that question, we have reason to believe that some Christians fled Judea before the war. This is a matter of looking back at some early Christian writings and seeing what they say. And yes, we do see something like this happening. So this event in church history is commonly known as the Flight to Pella. And it's named after the place where these Christians went, which is a city called Pella. Therefore, the Flight to Pella. Now, Pella, in case you're kind of mapping this out in your mind, maybe you can turn to the maps in the back of your Bible. It may not have Pella on there, but I can tell you roughly where it is, because it is kind of a podunk place in some respects. So Pella is located on the east side of the Jordan River, in the Jordan Valley, between the Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea. So find those two kind of lakes that are there in that part of the world, and roughly between that is where Pella is. And if you want me to link it to another place you might also see in the Gospels, you see sometimes a reference to the Decapolis, which means the 10 cities. Pella is one of those. So it's kind of this very Gentile region where some cities have been built, and Pella is one of those. All right, so let's talk about the evidence we have that there were Christians who left Judea and went to Pella before the Great Jewish Revolt. One source we have for this flight to Pella is the 4th century Christian historian named Eusebius of Caesarea. He wrote a book called the Ecclesiastical History, which is one of the major sources for early Christian history. If you have done any reading in church history, you know this work. But this is a big one, and Eusebius talks a little bit about this. Here's a quote from him. So, quote, "The people of the church in Jerusalem were commanded by an oracle given by revelation before the war to those in the city who were worthy of it, to depart and dwell in one of the cities of Perea, which they called Pella. Those who believed on Christ traveled there from Jerusalem, so that when holy men had altogether deserted the royal capital of the Jews and the whole land of Judea, the judgment of God finally fell." End quote. So that is Eusebius' description of the flight to Pella, of a bunch of these Christians leaving Jerusalem, leaving Judea, getting out of there before the hammer falls in the Great Jewish Revolt. We have another source for this flight to Pella, another 4th century Christian writer named Epiphanius of Salamis. This guy is not so well known as Eusebius is, but nonetheless he did do some writing back then, and we have some of his books. He writes about Christians returning to Jerusalem after the Great Jewish Revolt ended. So here we have kind of the other side of things, what happened next. After they laid low for a while out there in Pella, what happened after that? Well, he begins writing here from the perspective of a man named Aquila who visited Jerusalem at some point. So it's kind of from this traveler's perspective. So, quote, "So Aquila, while he was in Jerusalem, also saw the disciples of the apostles flourishing in the faith and working great signs, healings, and other miracles. For they were such as had come back from the city of Pella to Jerusalem and were living there and teaching. For when the city was about to be taken and destroyed by the Romans, it was revealed in advance to all the disciples by an angel of God that they should remove from the city as it was going to be completely destroyed. They sojourned as immigrants in Pella, the above city mentioned in Transjordania, and this city is said to be of the Decapolis." End quote. So there you have another kind of the afterword of the flight to Pella. You got some of these Christians coming back from there after the war was over. Now Epiphanius has some other notes about these Christians, but they are not all entirely flattering. And I want to read one of these to you just to know that not all things were well at this time. He actually writes that some of those Christians, some of them actually decided to stay in Pella permanently. So some came back to Jerusalem in that area. Others just stayed in Pella where they were. And those people that stayed became the founders of one of the more Jewish heretical kinds of Christianity called the Nazarenes. So he talks about these people, and I just want to read what he says because it's relevant to what we're talking about. So, quote, "This heresy of the Nazarenes exists in Berea, in the neighborhood of Syria, and in the Decapolis, in the region of Pella, and in Byzantius, in the so-called Kokaba. From there, it took its beginning after the exodus from Jerusalem, when all the disciples went to live in Pella, because Christ had told them to leave Jerusalem and go away, since it would undergo a siege," end quote. So that is another perspective from Epiphanius on all of this. Now, although that last piece is not so flattering, it gives us a lot of detail. When you think about the things that these two men talk about in these different passages, there's a lot of detail here of what was going on at that time. And that amount of detail leads me to believe that the event actually did happen, even if we have no written record of it for about 3 centuries. Admittedly, these sources are kind of late by comparison. They are about 3 centuries later, but they're very detailed, and also they differ from each other well enough that you can tell no one's copying each other. It's not like Epiphanius is copying Eusebius or vice versa. They seem to get this from independent sources, which tells me that it's much older than them. So all that to say, historically speaking, I feel like we're on pretty good ground to say there were a lot of Christians that left Judea and got out of there before all this stuff happened, which is at least kind of what Jesus has in mind, although I have one final question to raise about all this, which brings me to my last heading. In spite of all I just said about the flight to Pella and how prominent that is, I mean, basically you read any commentary on this part of Matthew and you will find people talking about the flight to Pella. I mean, it's very commonly known among the more scholastic types within Christianity. So it's very commonly known, but I have to wonder whether Christ might be describing some later chance to escape the Great Tribulation. Maybe after that wave of Christians left, I think maybe Jesus is talking about maybe a little bit later than that, honestly. And as I read about the flight to Pella, I can't help but notice 3 great differences between what they did and what Jesus says. Maybe you noticed some of these as I was reading those quotations to you, but there are 3 big differences. First, Epiphanius says that these Christians were warned by an angel, rather than attributing that to the words of the Olivet Discourse. He actually says that they were warned by an angel. So there is one thing. Now, to be fair, some of his other records, Epiphanius says nothing about the angel and does mention Christ as the one that warned them. So the third quotation that I read was actually that way. But the second one was an angel that warned them, right? So not exactly what we see in the Olivet Discourse necessarily. As for Eusebius, the first guy I read, he just credits an oracle, but he says nothing about where that oracle came from. You know, was that what Jesus said there on the Mount of Olives? Was it what this angel said that appeared out of nowhere? I mean, we don't have enough detail from him to say, but nonetheless, it proves my point that it doesn't exactly line up necessarily with what Jesus describes. He doesn't describe an angel warning anybody. By the way, those differences in detail between the accounts of the flight to Pella and what we read here in the Olivet Discourse also convinces me that they're not just making stuff up later on. Because if they were just making stuff up about Christians escaping Judea, they would have made it match more of what Jesus says. But they're just kind of going their own direction with this angel thing. So kind of also convinces me that it did happen. But the details are different enough between them and the Olivet Discourse that it might not be what Jesus has in mind. So there's one thing. Secondly, the flight to Pella was to Pella, a city in the Jordan River Valley. Now, one thing you might notice, valleys are not mountains, which is what Jesus says people, that's where Jesus says people should go. Let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains, or to the hills at least, not to the valley. Right? It's the opposite idea of what he has in mind. You know, it might apparently it worked for these Christians that left and went to Pella, but that's not where Jesus told them to go. Like, he told people to go to the hills, to the mountains. I mean, so there's a pretty big difference there. And then finally, both of our sources, Eusebius and Epiphanius, say that the flight to Pella happened before the war. You know, that's the wording they have, before the war. Now, in the Olivet Discourse, nobody has any reason to flee until they see the abomination of desolation, or if you follow Luke's gospel, until they see Jerusalem surrounded by armies. And that last detail makes it sound like the war has already started. You know, maybe not too far along, maybe not so late that you can't get out of there if you need to, but it sounds like the war is already happening, especially from Luke's gospel, which again sounds a little bit different than the flight to Pella. So again, I kind of have to ask the question, and it's an open-ended question. I don't have necessarily a strong answer to it, but I have to wonder if maybe Jesus has something else in mind. You know, maybe these words are for the people that didn't leave with that first wave, but he's telling them there's still a chance. It's going to be a lot harder. Would have been a lot easier if you had left with everyone else, but if you're going to stay around, when you see the abomination of desolation, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, you really need to get out of there. Okay, it's going to be really hard at that point, but you really need to run then. That might be more of what Jesus has in mind, and not necessarily the flight to Pella, as we call it. Okay, that is the substance of what I have to say today. I know there was a lot there. Here at the end, I just want to give kind of a final observation and do a final review, and then we'll be done with the sermon for today. Again, I want to draw this back into just generally how God's salvation often works. And I want to read a passage from 1 Peter chapter 4, verses 18 through 19. I just want to read this briefly to you because I thought of this as I was thinking about these things. Peter is talking about the salvation of your soul, but not so different from the mentality of what we're seeing today in the Olivet Discourse. Here's what Peter says. And if it is with difficulty that the righteous is saved, what will become of the godless man and the sinner? Therefore, those also who suffer according to the will of God shall entrust their souls to a faithful Creator in doing what is right. And that is often the case, whether in the calamities of this world or the great salvation worked by Jesus for all time, for our souls. One way or another, there's going to be salvation, but it's going to be really, really hard to get through that. You're going to suffer in some measure. Through many trials, we must enter the kingdom of God, as Luke says over in the book of Acts. Or he's quoting Paul, of course, when he says that. But that's basically the flavor of things. That's for our salvation here and now. That's for following this warning given by Jesus back there in the Olivet Discourse, all straight down the road here. Such a realization, of course, should make us yearn all the more for the return of Christ, when all these difficulties will be over and we will be saved and not in the process of trying to just hang on, until the great salvation comes to its fulfillment. So very much a motivation to keep looking forward and watching for the return of Christ and hoping for his final deliverance for all of us. Well, let's do a quick review then, and that'll be all for the sermon today. I called this sermon Head for the Hills based on what Jesus tells people to do. He tells them to head for the hills, basically. And I had my outline of 5 points here that I wanted to give to you. So first, I did a review of prior sermons, which was probably the densest part of the sermon, but I wanted to make sure it was all fresh in your mind. Secondly, I explained that people would either have judgment or salvation, depending on how hard they tried to understand the words of Jesus. And that is so for his words there in the Olivet Discourse. That is also true of the gospel. That is also true of all of you and how you handle the words of Jesus. So don't forget that for your own sakes as well. Thirdly, Jesus taught that this great tribulation is going to be so horrible that even fleeing from it might be a tribulation of its own. And there I spoke specifically about the Sabbath problems, but there's all kinds of other problems that Jesus mentions in the passage for those who would flee. Fourthly, I said we have reason to believe that some Christians did flee Judea before the war, which was the flight to Pella, of course. And then fifthly, I raised the question as to whether Jesus might have had a yet later escape in mind after the flight to Pella, one much more difficult, but one in which you could still get out of there if you acted quickly. And I raised that question as something that seems probable to me, just based on what we've been studying today. So that is all for today. Next time, we're still not moving forward in Matthew. Next time I have another sermon I want to do. I want to do some fine-tuning. I've said a lot of stuff, of course, on the first 21 verses of Matthew 24. I want to do another sermon that kind of fine-tunes some of our understanding of these things, and that'll be next time. I know it's kind of vague, but I can't think of any other quick way to say what I have planned the next time I preach, which will be in August, actually. Chad's going to be preaching for the next several times. So that's next time. Anyway, are there questions or comments that anyone has about the stuff I brought up today? If I know I'm going to be dealing with it later, I might defer you to a later sermon. But for today, any questions, we can deal with those now.